Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Allan Jude, your host for today's session. I'm Klara's co-founder and principal solution architect. Whether you're joining us live or watching this later, we really do appreciate your time. For those who are not familiar with Klara, we're a team of open source experts specializing in ZFS and FreeBSD and helping companies worldwide optimize their systems and tackle complex technical challenges. So if you are looking to re-architect your storage pool or figure out how to squeeze more performance out of a ZFS or FreeBSD system, or want to develop new features for FreeBSD or ZFS, please do get in touch with us. Today's session, RAID is not a backup and other hard truths about disaster recovery, is going to cover the following topics: how to create internally consistent backups of live systems and applications, how to decide what parts of your system you should back up versus which ones you can recreate, and the fact that no amount of RAID or ratio coding or anything like that is a replacement for having good backups. And lastly, tips on monitoring and testing your backups to make sure they work how you want. Our goal is to provide insights, real-world examples, and solutions, but feel free to drop your questions into Zoom, and we'll be answering those throughout. But joining us today is Colin Percival, so I'll pass it over to him to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Colin. For those of you who don't know me, I spent 7 years as FreeBSD security officer. That got me, made me aware of the need for secure backups, which led me to start my own company, Tarsnap, which is online backups for the truly paranoid. These days in FreeBSD, I maintain the EC2 platform, FreeBSD on EC2, that is. And I'm also the FreeBSD release engineer.
Yeah, so Colin knows pretty much everything there is to know about backups and has lots of interesting real-world experience to share with us. So getting into that, we've just finished our introductions, and then we'll talk about why RAID is not a backup and why it's not good enough, along with a number of related things. And then we'll talk about some of the reasons why backups are complicated, and then some great examples of how people thought they were doing their backups well, and it turned out they were not. And then we'll cap it off with some best practices, and then answer some extra questions that have come up. So starting off with the fact that the whole next couple of slides is about things that people think count as a backup when they really don't. So the first is RAID, right? RAID is about providing availability, increasing the uptime, making sure that when a drive fails, that the system doesn't go down and you can continue to run. The other option was it would fail and you would have to restore from backup. But just RAID is not the same as a backup. We've had people say in the past, oh, I don't need backups. I have RAID Z3. There's no way that I'm going to lose 4 drives at once, right? But then after they delete a file or make a change or something happens, they have their perfectly redundant, can withstand the failure of 3 disks copy of not their files, or the corrupt version of the file, or whatever the situation that happened. RAID is only protecting you against failing hardware. And so if anything else goes wrong, you're really going to wish that you had a backup.
Yeah, there's, just to jump in here, there's a lot of examples on these slides about ways that things have gone wrong, and I gave a lot of these to Allan when he asked me to join him on this webinar. And I don't want to embarrass any individual people, so almost all the examples that I gave him are things that have happened to multiple people. And this example of rm-rf space dot star, that has happened to many people. It is not just one person made a mistake. So do not think this will never happen to me, because it happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. Like, we've even seen a case where admin made a slightly different typo when changing some settings in ZFS and accidentally shrunk rather than expanded a ZVol in ZFS, and then sat there and watched while the system deleted 200 terabytes of their data and perfectly replicated across the RAID Z. And no amount of RAID Z was going to save them from the fact that they told the RAID Z to delete 200 terabytes of data.
Another interesting example of how multiple drives can fail at once. There was a firmware issue in some SSDs a while back where when it hit a certain number of hours of power on time, it would shut down the disk. And this would have been fine, except that people installed multiple identical drives when they set up a server. And so, of course, all of those disks hit 50,000 hours at the same time. Not so useful having that RAID.
Yep. So while RAID is great and it's good for protecting your uptime, it is not a replacement for a backup. You also need the backups. And having a copy of your files is not the same as having a backup. Often we hear people say, "Oh, I rsync my files to a second machine on a regular basis, so I'm all protected." But if a file gets corrupted, overwritten, encrypted by ransomware, or somehow your copy gets damaged, if you don't find out about that until after rsync is run, now the backup copy is just as bad as the primary. Because, well, sorry, the second copy is just as bad as the primary. That's not a backup copy because it's mutable.
And this applies to backups as well. The old way of doing backups on tapes, we talked about the grandfather father son model, where you have like monthly backups and weekly backups and daily backups. And the reason for having multiple tiers is that if you only keep a few daily backups and you don't notice that some data is being destroyed until a week later, it's too late. So you want to make sure you keep some older copies as well, so that if you don't discover corruption or data loss in time, you can go back to that old copy.
Exactly. If it's not a file you use every day, you might not notice, and you need to be able to go back in time to find the last time it was good. Especially with things like ransomware, if it starts spreading, you might notice it when it takes out a file that you do use a lot. But if it encrypted a file you didn't use 3 days ago, you're going to want to be able to go back to a backup from 4 days ago and get a copy of that file from before it was hit by ransomware, while maybe at the same time being able to restore other files from a less old copy based on when they got hit with the ransomware. And so having that kind of catalog of older copies is really important and part of what makes it a backup and not just a second copy. And then the same goes for any kind of cloud syncing, whether you're using something like Dropbox in a more office type setup, or doing full replication with a SharePoint or something. Anytime you make a change, the whole point of those tools is to get that change off to the other copy as quick as possible. Oftentimes destroying the good copy of the file with the bad copy.
And you should also be careful about systems that are marketed as backup tools. I'm not going to name names here, but there are some backup services out there which have a policy that if you delete a file on your local system, they will delete the backups of that file after a certain number of days. Which, okay, they don't want to keep a whole bunch of data that you don't care about anymore, but obviously it does mean that you need to notice if some of your data has been destroyed by ransomware quickly.
Yeah, otherwise you lose the ability to get it back. And that's why any kind of sync service is not a replacement for a backup service. And then finally, the biggest one we hear all the time is people who do their backups manually. I manually back up my files into a second drive and swap it with another location every so often. It's like, yeah, so what are the chances that backup's going to be current enough when you need it? And how often it's going to be like, oh, well, I've been meaning to do that for the last couple of weeks, but I've got busy and never got around to it.
Yeah, and that was one of the main reasons that I started Tarsnap. Actually, I said from the beginning, if I do not have online backups that can happen automatically whenever my laptop is connected to the internet, it's not going to happen, because I've tried to do backups manually, and like for a couple of years I had a USB, but back in the days that we had spinning Rust disks connected over USB, a USB enclosure sitting on my desk, and I didn't actually do backups. Like it was there for the purpose of doing backups, and they didn't happen. So that's one of the great things about something online. You could just set it to happen automatically.
Yeah, for sure. And especially from like a sysadmin perspective, I like to think about it like the change when we switched to using Let's Encrypt instead of manually renewing certificates. When it was a certificate that had to be manually renewed once a year or so, it was this big thing, and you often forget until it was almost time and your monitoring was going off or whatever. Whereas with Let's Encrypt, because it happens automatically every so many days, I don't have to worry about it anymore. My monitoring makes sure that it continues to happen and I can intercede if something goes wrong, but I'm not manually thinking about the steps and looking up how to do the steps because I only do this once a year or whatever. Uh, really getting the level of automation you want on your backups makes a big difference to A, making sure they actually happen, and B, just making sure that they're going to be done consistently and they're going to be there when you need them. So now getting into some of the ways that backups are complicated and some of the considerations you want to have for doing good backups. So obviously, if you are protecting your data with a backup, what are you protecting the backup with? So getting to start thinking about that. So the first thing is that there's no magic bullet. Like Colin and I can't just give you the answer that'll be the perfect backup system for you. The best backup strategy for one situation or one person is going to be completely different and not even necessarily safe for another person. It really depends on the applications and the use cases and the threat and every other factor that goes into this to decide what is the best way to do a backup. So we can't give universal advice, but we can help you avoid some of the really common traps that people tend to fall into.
And you might think, since I run a backup service, that is my day job, but providing that service, I would be telling you Tarsnap is the magic bullet. You should be using Tarsnap. But I have had many email exchanges with people where they've emailed me saying, "Here's my situation. I need backups." And I've written back to them saying, Tarsnap is just not the solution for you. You want to do it this other way because you have too much data for Tarsnap to handle, or your internet connection isn't fast enough, or whatever. There are many reasons why people might not want to use Tarsnap. Although I personally think Tarsnap is an awesome backup tool, but fundamentally I designed Tarsnap around my own personal needs, which clearly overlaps with a significant number of people because there's a few thousand people using Tarsnap, but it is not the tool for everybody.
So the most important part of a backup is actually doing it, right? The best time to start doing your backups was yesterday. The second best time is now. Uh, and the most common time people start thinking about doing backups is after their data is already lost.
And this comes up a lot with startup companies. People start a company and they're all excited about building a product, and before they have anything built, they don't have anything to worry about backing up. And then once they start building something, they're so busy with building and hiring new people and talking to customers, they just never get around to it.
So the most important thing to consider when you're designing your backup system is what are the backups for? What threats are you trying to protect your data from? Some of the most common ones obviously are hardware failure. If we lose the whole machine, if it won't boot, whatever, how do I get the data back and get, my team back to being able to do work or my website back online or whatever? Natural disaster. We've seen, we had to do, Klara did a data recovery for a company in Florida earlier last year after a hurricane hit and, their servers got wet with seawater. That is not easy to recover from. You know, they really wish they had had better backups and didn't need to resort to trying to recover data from hard drives that had gotten wet. But also accidental deletion. How often has somebody accidentally deleted the wrong file, or something accidentally corrupted it, or something, or ransomware? That's been a huge threat for a number of years, and being able to get back your files from however many days ago it turns out was the start of the ransomware infection is really important. And oftentimes people find that their backup window isn't big enough. They only kept daily backups for 5 days or something. And it turns out sometimes it's been 8 days since you actually got hit with ransomware, and you really wish you could go back a little further. And then, especially with Tarsnap, I know one of the design considerations was, what about a lost or stolen device, and how do I get my files back and rebuild my laptop and make sure that the person who stole my laptop doesn't have access to my backups.
Yeah, on the topic of natural disasters, one famous story in the backup world is when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Um, a whole bunch of companies lost their data there, but they had backups. But their backups were stored in the basement, which, if you have a hurricane and the entire city or a large chunk of the city is flooded, um, anything you have in the basement is not going to be very useful to you. So, you need to think about not just what threat are you protecting your data from, but also how does that threat affect how you need to do backups. If you're worried about getting a hurricane and flooding, uh, the basement is not the place to store your backups.
Yeah, actually, Klara has a customer that's right near the water in New Orleans. And so, lesson learned from last time, their remote ZFS replica of their 1 petabyte machine is under a mountain in Virginia at the other end of a 1 gigabit point to point link. And it replicates backups every 15 minutes to make sure that the next time that the tide comes up and washes over their machines, that they'll be able to restore from their backups uh, that won't have gotten wet at the same time. So then, another question that I found really interesting from some of the material Colin provided was actually deciding what to back up, because some of the answers he had differed from what I would have thought at first. So the first one was whether you should back up the operating system as part of your backup. And I had mostly thought that no, that's something I'll just reinstall. But Colin had some really interesting advice about that.
Yeah, so again, this is things that actual people have run into in multiple times in most cases, and this is actually one that I ran into myself. Um, I had not been backing up the entire operating system and all of my packages that I had installed on FreeBSD, and then I needed to restore the system, and it turned out that the one of the packages I used, in fact, it was something I used for generating PDF invoices for Tarsnap. Um, I couldn't get the same version of that. The package I had installed, I installed it 2 years ago, and that version was deprecated or something. I can't remember the exact details. Anyway, I thought I had reinstalled everything, and then at the end of the month, I generate all these PDF invoices and send out hundreds and hundreds of emails with invoices to customers. And I started getting emails back saying, "Is there something wrong with this PDF?" It turns out that the tool didn't actually install properly, and so I sent out a whole bunch of PDF files that were actually just empty files. Um, so yeah, lesson learned. When you're recovering from data loss, in this case, my laptop died, and I needed to download all my data onto a new laptop. That is not the time that you're going to be wanting to be really careful about. Double check out all these tools, are they all compatible with the version I had before. That's when I've been offline for a couple of days because I needed to get this new laptop and get it set up. So yeah, you really want to make sure that you can just have something that you drop in and it works, without worrying about retesting all these things.
Yeah, especially when it's something that's been off in production. All those packages work together. If you reinstall and get the latest version of all those things, maybe there's some incompatibility or some packages just missing at the time, or who knows what, means that the system won't be exactly the same. So if you just back it up, it doesn't take that much more space, and it means that when you restore, everything will just work again. Uh,
Yeah.
Failing that,
No, I
at
mean,
least,
if you go with the cattle rather than pets approach of running servers, where maybe you're redeploying your server every week with the latest version of packages. Maybe you don't need to worry about it, but it's something you need to think about at least.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the kind of other ways you can do that is basically by making sure you have backups of the packages. So the actual package files, so that you can reinstall the OS and the things, but you can make sure that you have the exact packages that were installed on the machine originally, or at the time of the backup. So yeah, like you said, if you're
Right.
doing cattle, maybe you have your own package repo and you will have the packages, but make sure that you have backups of those so that you can get exactly the packages that were on that machine. Because like you said, when you're, you know, it's the middle of the night and you're restoring from a backup in production, you want to just get it back exactly how it was, not also be dealing with upgrading everything to the latest version as part of restoring the backup. That's not a 3 a.m. activity. You will really hate yourself. So you want to make sure that you're able to get the machine back how it was, not how it would be if it was fresh.
Right.
And then the big one, obviously, is backing up the configuration of the machine. And in particular, Colin had notes about having possibly a longer retention policy on the backups of the configuration so that you can figure out, when something changed or undo a change that it turned out had a side effect that you didn't find out about for a long time.
And this can also be very important for security auditing. A number of times people have found a system was compromised, and it was only by going through their old backups that they figured out when that line was added to etc master.password.
Yeah, a lot of things like that. And like I said, especially the configuration doesn't tend to take a lot of space. So maybe you want to keep daily backups of that for months rather than just a couple of days like you might do with bigger or faster changing data. And
Yeah, I
so
mean,
being able to
in
have
my
different
case, I,
policy.
I have backups of my /etc from every hour in the past 5 years because it's tiny.
Mhm. Exactly. But the other biggest consideration when deciding what to back up is deciding what not to back up. Having a well-defined, documented, and enforced exclusion policy. This directory doesn't get backed up. That's where you put the scratch stuff. But don't put anything in there that you can't deal with going completely away. We ran into this with a university who had, a production system and a scratch system, and it turned out because of a lack of free space, a bunch of researchers had put work they needed on the scratch space, and so when it broke, suddenly they were having to pay to have someone come in and recover the data rather than just it was in their backups because it was on the scratch that wasn't being backed up and they hadn't done a good enough job enforcing that people only stored ephemeral files on the scratch space.
And the flip side of that, which I've come across many times with Tarsnap, is I'll notice that a Tarsnap user has been using like the same amount of data, say 30 gigs of data they have stored, constantly for a long time, and then suddenly they jump up to 300 gigs of data storage. And I'll send them, if I notice this, I'll send them an email saying, "Hey, did you notice this? Was this deliberate?" And when I've sent emails like that, almost always the answer comes back, "Oh, yeah, I forgot that directory was being backed up. I did not mean to put all of those movies I downloaded into that directory."
Yep. So now we've talked about some of the basics. We'll get into a little bit more of how people tend to run afoul of setting up their backups correctly and just some of the choices they end up regretting. So the first one obviously is if you just back up the files, because files change, including changing while you're backing them up. If you just read a file while it's changing, you can end up with an unusable result, right? If you're backing up an SQL database file while it's being changed, your backup of the first half of the file is before some of those change, and the backup of the second half of the file is after. And if the change happened to touch both pieces, now you have a copy of your database that doesn't ever match what was ever in the database at any time and may actually be corrupted and not usable.
Yeah, and this is particularly an issue for database files because databases they do make changes, sort of jumping all over the file. If you're backing up a mail spool, you're probably fine because if mail arrives while you're reading, while the backup tool is reading the file, it gets appended to the end of the file, and so you just the backup tool just won't get the last few emails that arrived. But yeah, or same thing with log files. You don't get the last few lines of log files. Well, that's fine. You still have a consistent copy of what was there at some point. But yeah, databases are particularly an issue because they do this thing of jumping around. Also, VM images. If you have a running VM, then whatever's running inside the VM will be making changes to its virtual disk, and that will again be changes sort of scattered all over the VM disk image.
Yeah, and depending on the applications you use, some applications have multiple files that actually depend on each other, and your backup's going to have a version of each of those files from a different time, and so it may refer to changes in a second file that was backed up previously, and so those changes don't exist yet, and so it points to an offset in that file that doesn't exist, and you can get all kinds of really strange errors in your application. And really, the only way to avoid this is to make sure the source of your backup, what you're backing up, is a consistent snapshot, whether that's UFS or ZFS or LVM or whatever platform you're using. If you can get a snapshot, that means you'll take your entire backup from a single point in time, right? Every single file will be from the exact same second. Whereas if you just back up a live file system, then you're going to get every file will be backed up from the time it got backed up, not from all the files being at the same time.
Yeah, and before we had file system snapshots, the standard way that this would be done would be you turn the database server off, and then when there's no process running to make changes to the files, then nothing will be changed, and that's why it used to be, and in some cases still is the case, that some government services or banks you wouldn't be able to log in and do anything at 2 a.m. because that is their 2-hour window every day where they shut down all the database servers and do their backups and then start everything up again. I think Alan's probably run into that with the Canada Revenue Agency a few times.
Last weekend.
Right.
It was down from Friday to Monday morning.
Yeah, I think that was a software upgrade rather than a backup,
Yes,
but yes.
exactly.
In any case, these days with file system snapshots, it's so much easier. You can snapshot things and then do a backup of the snapshot without actually shutting down the entire server.
Yeah, but it's also why backups used to be something that happened over the weekend because nobody would be at the office changing files,
Right.
and same for at night and so on. But you also run into the problem of if you have so much data, it takes too long to back up, then you can't fit in that window. And how do you do it? And the answer is a snapshot. But another very common issue is selecting which service to use for your backups. So in this example, go ahead.
Yeah, this is I've seen it a number of times. I've been running Tarsnap. Well, I started writing code in 2006 and launched it publicly in 2008. So it's been around for 17 years now. And over that time, I've seen a lot of other backup services start up and then shut down because it's a world of internet startups. Maybe they get some seed money, they start running. They try to get money from VCs, and if they're not profitable, then they either get money from VCs or they shut down, or they get bought out by another company that then shuts them down. And so I've seen a lot of other companies start up, and they look good, but then a while later they shut down. And I mean, there have been a few times I've sort of looked at their pricing and be like, I don't know how you're possibly making profit at those prices, because I know how much it costs to store data, and you're charging 30 cents per terabyte of data. Disks cost a bit more than that. How is this working? And the answer is it wasn't working. They were burning through their seed money, and then they shut down.
Yeah, especially when you see offers like backup as much data as you need for $5 a month. It's like, well, that's not going to work. So in particular, if your account is going to cost the backup provider more money than you're paying them, why are they doing it? And maybe you want to look at finding a different solution.
Yeah, and there's sometimes you see them. The reality doesn't necessarily quite match the advertising. there's some services out there which allow you to store an unlimited amount of data, but then they throttle your upload rate. And the more data you upload, the slower the uploads get. So unlimited isn't necessarily unlimited, which could be a good thing because it means that they're not actually losing money on these unlimited customers. But of course, if you have a lot of data and they're not letting you upload it, that doesn't help you either.
And it makes you wonder, are they going to throttle you when you try to download it, when you're trying to restore from backup?
And that could also be an issue, yes.
Yeah. And then we wanted to share a couple of stories of how things went wrong sometimes. So one example was having backups, but they weren't off-site. So this story, last night someone broke into our office and stole the server. Unfortunately, I had left the backup tape in the drive instead of taking it home with me.
And again,
So they had
this
a
gets
backup.
into the doing things manually. If you're doing your backups manually, it's you need to physically take that disk tape out of the drive and take it home, and people forget to do things like that.
Yep. Did you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this has happened a few times. I know of. You need to make sure that your backups are somewhere secure, because if somebody can tamper with your backups, then you restore from the backups, and they have now tampered with your live data, because they got in through the backups, and this is why it's important to actually verify your backups. With Tarsnap, I have cryptographic signing. Maybe you don't need to go that far. Maybe you just make get the SHA-256 sum of your backup tarball and write it down somewhere, of course. But yeah, you need to make sure that what you're storing is actually your data, not somebody else's version of your data.
Yeah, I think this case was especially interesting as it seems that the point of the do not allow servers attack that knocked the original server offline was to get them to restore from their
Exactly.
corrupted backup, so that
Yes.
the new primary server would already be compromised when it was stood up.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the problem of if you put too many of your eggs in one backup or one basket.
Yes,
So
and,
if
and
there's
and this is something that happened to a large financial services company on 9/11. They had their offices in one tower, and they had their backups in the basement of the other tower. Now, hopefully, this is not something we need to worry about happening very often in the future. Hopefully, it will never happen again. But you certainly need to be aware that um, okay, so it was a terrorist attack at 9/11, but if it was an earthquake or a flood or some sort of natural disaster, it could have also affected both towers. So really, you want your backups to be significantly offsite.
Yeah, and even like you're saying, a previous example I saw about the basement was
Right.
when I think it was Hurricane Sandy hit New York. Uh, it wasn't the data, but for a data center, their supply of diesel fuel for the generators was in the basement because by fire code, they can only store a small feeder tank on the upper floors of the building. But then all that fuel was contaminated by the floodwater, and so the whole building went offline. And obviously,
Yeah.
if backup servers had been in that basement, they would have been underwater and not helpful as well. So
Yes,
basements, not
I
always a great
remember.
place for backups.
Yes, I remember during Hurricane Katrina, there was somebody that worked at a day center in New Orleans was posting online about uh, walking up and down 10 flights of stairs carrying containers of diesel fuel because it was all stored in the basement and they needed to get it all upstairs before the floodwater came in and contaminated all the fuel.
Yep. And then another example of why you really want your backups to be encrypted. In this case, an attacker managed to compromise the backup server and then read through the backups and find the MySQL root password and then use that to attack the live site.
Yeah, and obviously if they can get your backups, then they've got your data, and this is why I created Tarsnap, really, because I as security FreeBSD security officer I was dealing with a lot of very sensitive data, and I wanted backups, but I thought, wait a minute, if somebody gets their hands on my backups, we're really in trouble, because then they know about all these vulnerabilities that have not been published yet.
Yeah, and kind of related to this one, you have to make sure that your backup server does not have the ability to delete things from your primary server, or the primary server doesn't have the ability to delete the backups.
Yeah, you definitely want to be careful about any sort of crossover there, because if somebody can get into one system, you want to make sure that they do not affect both systems.
Yep. And then, of course, the biggest thing is you have to actually monitor those backups, right? If they're going to be automated and happening all the time, so you're not having to do them manually, uh, you don't want to find out that, oh, it hasn't been working for who knows how long.
Yeah, so I mean, the standard Unix approach is you've got a cron job, and you get an email from the cron job. These days, because SMTP is difficult and a lot of sites block outgoing email and all that, maybe email is not the best approach for you, but you need to make sure you have something. In my case, I do still rely on, I'm an old school Unix guy at this point, I guess. I do rely on emails, and the first thing I do when I deploy a new system is set up a tunnel so that it can send email to my email server that is not going over port 25, so it doesn't get blocked or anything.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is you want to make sure that if a backup doesn't work, you will get notified, and that you will get notified in a kind of noisy way. Like it's not just going
Yes.
to be one of 1,000 emails. It's not a subtle difference in the email you get from the server every day. It's going to be like, hey, backups aren't working. Pay attention to me. Fix this.
Yeah.
Because if that goes on for a couple of days, then you're not going to have the backups you need when you need them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of tools out there for people who don't want to use email. If you're one of these people that wants to use HTTP APIs for everything, there are a number of companies out there providing services where you set up your backup script that after it creates a backup, it pings the server, and then their service, if it doesn't get pinged for 2 days in a row or something, it will start emailing you, texting you, phoning you, whatever, to make sure that hey, this thing that was supposed to happen did not happen.
So lastly, we'll talk about a couple of best practices to make sure that your backups are done right. Obviously, that is setting up automatic offsite backups that even if you don't think what you have to back up is worth it, you'll be glad you have backups when it turns out actually it is. And as we just talked about, making sure that you will know if your backups ever fail, even a little bit, even just once. Uh, and make sure at least 2 independent people have tested restoring from the backups.
And this is
Way too
something
many
that
stories.
I've seen a number of times. I've gotten emails like, hey, we just lost our data on our servers, and the sysadmin who knows how to restore our data just left on his honeymoon for 2 weeks. He's hiking in the mountains of New Zealand. We have no way to get in contact with him. Can you tell us how to restore our backups? And I mean, I might be able to. If you have your Tarsnap keys, I can probably help you get your backups back. If there's a passphrase on those keys, and you just fired your sysadmin, who is the only person who knew the passphrase, you're probably going to be in trouble. So yeah, you need to make sure that at least 2 people know how to do this, and if you have not tried, then you do not know how to do it.
Yeah, this is definitely what I've tried to drill into people. When you're having to deploy restoring your backups, it's going to be the worst possible time, right? It's going to be 3 a.m. You've not slept, you're groggy, whatever. You want to be able to just follow a procedure that was written down, has been tested over and over again, and you know how to do it. And every single step is there, and you're not going to hit some random gotcha where some piece is missing, or you need some passphrase that you don't have, or whatever. You really want to make sure that you are testing restoring your backups, because turns out nobody actually cares whether things are backed up or not. They care about whether they can restore it or not.
Right. Yeah, and as we often say in the backup world, if you have not tested restores then you do not have backups.
Exactly. And then to reiterate what we talked about before, you want to make sure you're backing up the system configuration files as well, ideally with as much retention as you can have, and that you have either are backing up the as installed software or keeping the original packages so that you can get the system back to the state it was in when it was backed up, not we rebuilt the server new and it's got newer versions of the packages and maybe something doesn't work or something's incompatible or whatever. It won't be the same as the system it was replacing. And the point of the backup is to get back to how it was yesterday as easily as possible.
Yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention earlier about backing up installed software. If you are one of the unlucky people who deals with commercial software with licensing, which is tied to hardware, you need to be very careful about this because you might restore the identical software and then have it say, "Oh, I am not licensed for this
This
particular
MAC
machine,"
address.
because MAC address, whatever it checks. So if you're dealing with software like that, then that just it adds another layer of complexity you need to think through and test, ideally, restoring onto a different box to make sure that it will work.
Exactly. That's again part of the testing is making sure that not only did all the files come back, but does all the software start? Does it actually work? Does it complain that you know you don't have a license because the hardware is different? And then you want to have a documented backup retention policy. So that is how long we're keeping these backups and know that, when someone asks, are we going to have a copy of this file from 12 days ago? That you should just know the answer to that, not have to be, well, we'll have to look and see what the system actually did. Uh, and also, like we talked about, the exclude directories, right? What doesn't get backed up and make sure that A, it's not getting backed up and filling up your backups, but also that nobody's storing files there that they're going to expect you to restore from the backup that doesn't exist.
And when it comes to that backup retention policy, it's not just useful for making sure that you have the data that you think you have, and vice versa, but it will be useful for other threats like lawyers, because lawyers love to come to people with legal documents saying you must hand over every piece of data you have related to X, and if you could say, well, our backup retention policy says that we delete everything after 10 days and we make sure that we follow that policy, um, that makes their life a lot easier dealing with lawyers.
Yeah, rather than, all right, we have to restore every version of this file we've ever had, and it turns out we have backups going back 6 years, then that's a whole lot of extra work. Lastly, you want to try to reduce the possible failures in your backup system. So that is, don't rely on services that are losing money on your account. Make sure the system that's being backed up doesn't have the ability to delete its backups if it gets compromised, or that the backup system doesn't have the ability to reach over to the live system and destroy it or compromise it, and so on. And you want to make sure your backups are encrypted so that other people can't see them because they may contain secrets like keys and passwords and so on. And you want to make sure that your backups are verified somehow, whether that's a cryptographic signature or a hash or whatever, so that you know when you go to restore it that this is my backup as I made it, not a version that someone has modified. Then when I restore it, I'm going to end up with a compromised machine. All right. So thank you for being with us today. And if you're interested in getting your storage set up to be able to do these type of consistent backups or having us design a solution specific to your use case, then please do check out our storage design implementation and our support subscription services. We have a little bit of time for questions. Does anybody have any questions? So Marin asks if we have any tips on how to monitor your backups to make sure that they're being completed correctly?
How to monitor them? Well, I mean, the first thing is you have a command which is running and check the exit code of that process. Um, a lot of people don't do that. um, ideally, it should exit without printing any error messages. Cron does have this nice thing where if a process prints anything to standard error, it will email it to you. Again, old school Unix approach, but there's a reason it did that. Um, so yeah, obviously, if the backup tool knows that it failed, then you need to make sure that you listen when it tries to tell you that. Um, Beyond that, obviously, well, test the backups. You don't necessarily have to download your backup every day, but very easy thing to do is just like look at the server and list what backups are there. And if you didn't get a new backup appearing overnight, then it didn't run or something broke. You should look into it.
No. Andrew asks, do you feel tape still has a place in backups?
It can. If you're dealing with tape, then you're inherently dealing with something manual because, well, you have to put that tape into the drive and take it out. Okay, there's tape robots as well, but
Even
depending on
those,
the
eventually you have to swap them out.
right, yeah. I think tape is more of a solution for people who have terabytes of data rather than gigabytes of data. In terms of the convenience factor, in terms of the cost factor, you've got a tape drive, you've got a bunch of tapes. If you're not going to be using a significant fraction of those tapes, it's going to be cheaper to upload it somewhere. But
Yeah,
yeah, tape is one option, and it's part of the storage hierarchy.
yeah. Although I've found as we're as hard drives are getting cheaper per terabyte and so on, that the advantages of tape are dwindling, especially
Yes.
comparing having some tapes in a box to having an online replica using ZFS. The fact that you can do a scrub and verify all the data much more quickly, and that you can access individual files kind of full random access, whereas a tape you have to wait for it to seek through the whole tape and find where that one file is. Your restoration times can be a lot better off not tape. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
tapes are inherently for very cold storage. You also have some people using this approach of taking very large spinning Rust disks and then filling them up and then taking them offline because at a certain point, just the power consumption of keeping spinning Rust disks spinning 24 hours a day actually ends up being quite a lot of money just for that power.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a hierarchy, and yeah, I agree. The space for tapes is dwindling, but there are still some places where it is the right solution. You really need to think about how much data you have and how often do you need to access it and how quickly do you need to access it, and sort of put together a spreadsheet and work through all the numbers.
Yep. So Brad says, I understand that snapshots do not constitute a backup, which is a good point that we didn't actually talk about earlier. Um, but it says, does this apply if you replicate those snapshots to another device and retain them for a period of time?
Yeah, I mean, if you're replicating them and then retaining them, then that is a backup. Yes, retaining them could be um, if you're doing backups of the snapshot, that is just taking that data and copying it somewhere else. So yeah, if you're copying it somewhere else and retaining it, that is a backup. Absolutely.
Exactly. So yeah, if as long as just having the snapshots on the one machine is not a backup, but if you
Right.
are replicating them, then it becomes a backup.
Yes, and ideally you want to be replicating them and keeping multiple snapshots, not just like always overwriting the previous one with the latest one, because
Yeah,
at that point that's just like syncing it rather than doing backups.
exactly. You want to keep quite a retention. Oftentimes, while you might keep, 5 daily snapshots on the source, your backup ideally would keep an even longer history than the primary does.
Yeah, and then just going back to the issue of storage hierarchies, backup is inherently not something that you need to be accessing quickly in terms of seek times and so on, because generally you back up a whole bunch of data, or you're writing a whole bunch of data, or you're storing a whole bunch of data. So you may be able to, yeah, I mean, you storing multiple snapshots may be a larger volume of data, but it might actually cost you less because you can use cheaper disks. Maybe you use spinning less disks to store the backups, where you use SSDs on the live server, because the live server you need to have lots of IOPS for your database that's running.
Uh, Chris has maybe an interesting one here. Uh, People and businesses are backing up their data to Tarsnap. What is Tarsnap's backup strategy for that data?
So Tarsnap stores all the data into Amazon S3, which um, Amazon does a lot of work to make sure that data does not get lost in Amazon S3, and they replicate data across multiple data centers. Um, they haven't publicly gone into details about exactly how they store data within those data centers. I'm a Amazon Web Services hero, and I do know some details I can't talk about. But in any case, they design for 11 nines of durability. Now, I haven't actually got a straight answer from them about whether that's 11 nines for each individual object or for everything collectively. But in any case, they're not going to lose your data. Probably high up on the list of ways that your data could be lost is a meteor hitting Washington D.C. and or North Virginia and wiping out a 100-mile radius.
And one attendee asks, do you still consider backups that haven't been tested to be a backup? And I think we kind of already answered that. No,
Yeah,
if you're
I
not
mean,
testing them, that's not a backup.
yeah, I mean, it sort of is, but like it might be a backup, but you don't know if it's a backup until you've tested it.
Yeah, that's I think an even clearer way to put
Yeah,
it.
if you haven't tested it, you have Schrodinger's backup.
And then Jason asks, would you recommend the same RAID Z level on a backup server? Maybe you can talk about considerations on reliability of the backup server. I think that's mostly a question of costs and trade-offs. Um,
Yeah,
Generally, you're while you do worry about the availability of your backup, because if your backup is down, then you're not able to take new backups and you're not able to restore backups. So you do want enough redundancy that it's not an issue. Although oftentimes your target is to have your backup machine be bigger than the thing it's backing up so it can have a longer retention. And sometimes that does mean a trade off of not necessarily having as much redundancy as the live system.
yeah, and you also want to think about performance, especially in terms of IOPS, because backups are primarily what you care about is disk throughput, not disk IOPS. And so that, I mean, I'm not the ZFS expert here, but I know there are some trade-offs in terms of how you configure ZFS to get more throughput versus more IOPS.
Yeah, and so it's oftentimes that the thing you're backing up will be configured different than the backup would be. Great. Well, thank you so much, Colin, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank everyone for attending.